I want to begin this morning's message with a question. Have you ever hit kind of a low point in your life where you really needed some help? And so you go to somebody that you think you can trust and you ask them for help, but instead of offering you help, they only wind up inflicting hurts. Has that ever happened to you? So years ago when I was in seminary, I was studying to become a pastor, but when I was in seminary, I had kind of a career crisis, and even though I was studying to become a pastor, I wasn't quite sure that I wanted to actually become a pastor. And so one night, it was kind of like a very deep struggle for me, and I pick up the phone, and I call a pastor friend of mine who had been my pastor when I was in college before I got to seminary. And I had talked to him about my career crisis before many times, so it was like 9 or 9:30 at night. I pick up the phone, I call him, he answers, and because I'm so stressed out about my career crisis, I don't even start with pleasantries like, hey, how's your day been, how you're doing. I just kind of launch into my swan song and my sad soliloquy about how hard this career crisis is for me. And so I start talking for like 3-4 minutes. And finally, after about 4 minutes, this pastor friend of mine, he cuts me off. And he says to me, you know, Zach, we've talked about this before. We've talked about this many times before. And I've told you everything about your career crisis that I think I can tell you when I don't have much left to say and I don't have a lot of help left to give. I'm sorry, I gotta go now. And he kind of curtly dismisses himself, says goodbye, and he hangs up the phone, and I was devastated. That night, I actually went and I talked to some seminary buddies of mine. And I talked to them about this phone call that I had with my college pastor. And I said to them, I used to think he was a great pastor, but now I think he's just and I think the word I probably used was the word jerk, because this guy had hurt me. I had reached out to him in a moment of crisis, asking for help, and he only inflicted hurt. Has that ever happened to you, too? So, we are in week 2 of a series here at Zion we're calling Roller Coaster, Navigating Life's Ups and Downs. And kind of the big idea behind this series is that in a lot of ways, life is like a roller coaster. A roller coaster is one of those rides where you can walk on ready to have a really good time and you walk off needing some chiropractic care, right? Because it shoots you up and down and whips you back and forth and all around. And that is the way that life works. You can have highs and you can have lows. You can have good days, you can have bad days. You can have wonderful days, you can have tragic days. It whips you up and down and all around. Life can give you whiplash, and you need a little bit of chiropractic care for your heart, for your soul, for your relationships. And this series is devoted to talking about that kind of care that we all need for all of life's highs and all of life's lows. And today, as we continue our series, we're going to talk about what to do when you are going through one of those difficult times and you do go looking for care. You do go asking somebody for help, but instead of making things better, they only make things worse. Instead of offering the help that you need, they only inflict hurt that you don't want. Now, as we get into this topic this morning, I need to be honest about something. One of the places that people often go when they're going through a tough time and they're looking for help, one of the places that people often go is a place like this. They come to a church looking for help. And yet, if we're really honest about ourselves, sometimes in the church, people come looking for help and we only wind up inflicting hurt. And this happens to a lot of people. They reach out to the church because they're going through a tough time, so they send an email or make a phone call, but they never get a phone call back, or they never get an email back. And it feels like their request has gone into somebody's spam folder. They're looking for help, but they only wind up getting hurt. Or you join a brand new church and you want to get involved and you want to get connected, so you start volunteering. And all of a sudden you find yourself doing everything but preaching on Sunday morning, right? And all you wanted to do was help, but now you're overwhelmed. And you kind of feel used and abused and hurt. Or maybe you've been around a church for a long time and there's somebody inside that church that you think you can trust. And so you go to them and you share with them some deep, stark struggle you're having. And here's what you want. You want prayer and you want grace. But it turns out that instead of prayer and grace, you get gossip. And people are talking about you. You go to somebody looking for help, but you only wind up getting hurt. Today we're going to walk through and work through a story in the Gospel of Mark chapter 9, and it's the story about a man who's in desperate need of help. And so here's what he does. He goes to the church. He goes to some church people looking for help. But instead of getting help, he only winds up getting hurt. In fact, let me begin by just setting a little bit of context around this story. At the beginning of the Gospel of Mark chapter 9 is the story of Jesus, who goes on a hiking trip with three of his closest disciples, Peter, James, and John. They go up a mountain in ancient Israel named Mount Tabor. And when they get to the top or to the summit of this mountain, Pastor Kyle talked about this last weekend in his message, something amazing and miraculous happens. When they get to the top of the mountain, these three disciples with Jesus see Jesus' appearance begin to change. His clothes become dazzling white, and Jesus begins to glow. And it's at this point that these three disciples begin to know that they are with a man who is not just a man. They are with a man who also seems to be none other than God. Well, while Jesus and Peter, James, and John are up at the top of Mount Tabor, the other disciples, Jesus had 12 disciples, so the other 9 disciples are at the bottom of Mount Tabor when they get this kind of bright idea. They decide that they want to host a healing service where like people can bring their sick people, or people who are sick can come to them and they will lay hands on them and they will be able to heal them. And the disciples think they can do this because after all, they've been with Jesus. And Jesus has become well known as an incredible healer. With just a touch, Jesus can make blind people see. With just a word, Jesus can make paralyzed people walk. And the disciples get it in their heads that maybe some of that Jesus juice has rubbed off on them. And so maybe what Jesus has done, they can do too. And so they host this giant healing service, and the crowds go wild. Everybody comes to the disciples because they want to be healed by the disciples of all their diseases. But the healing service winds up being a total flop. Because as it turns out, the Jesus juice hasn't quite rubbed off on the disciples in the way that they thought it should and thought it would. And so all these people start coming to the disciples to be healed, and the disciples can't heal them. All these people start coming to the disciples looking for help. They start coming to church people looking for help. But they only wind up getting hurt. And it's there that we pick up the story in Mark chapter 9. Mark chapter 9, verse 14. When Jesus and his 3 disciples, Peter, James, and John, when they came down the mountain to the rest of the disciples, the other 9 disciples, they saw a large crowd around the other 9 disciples. And there were the teachers of the law. And the teachers of the law, they're like Jewish religious scholars. And they were arguing with the disciples. And the reason the teachers of the law were arguing with the disciples is because the teachers of the law were always kind of skeptical of Jesus and his disciples. They kind of had this assumption that Jesus and his disciples were like charlatans and hucksters. And so when the disciples decide that they're going to hold this healing service, they're already a little bit cynical about what's fixing to happen. And when they see that the disciples cannot do what they claim to be able to, when the healing service becomes a flop, the teachers of the law go from being skeptical of the disciples to downright hostile to the disciples. And so they wind up in this big argument. And Jesus steps into the middle of this argument. Verse 16, he says to his disciples, "What are you arguing with the teachers of the law about?" And it's at this point that a man in the crowd emerges and he says, listen, Jesus, I can tell you what they're arguing about. Teacher, he says, I brought you my son, who's possessed by like a demon, by a spirit that has robbed him of his speech. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him to the ground, he foams at the mouth, he gnashes his teeth, and he becomes rigid. Now, I want to pause right here on the story. If you kind of look at this symptom list, okay? Somebody foams at the mouth, gnashes their teeth, they fall to the ground, and they become rigid. This sounds like a well-known medical condition in the 21st century. Anybody know what it sounds like if you just look at the symptom list? It sounds like epilepsy. This sounds like and looks like and seems like an epileptic seizure that this kid is going through. And so this kind of begs a question, and a lot of people ask it, like, why would this father think that his son is demon-possessed? Is this one of these things where, like, in the first century, they didn't have all the medical technology that we have in the 21st century, and so they got a little bit superstitious, and they chalked a medical condition up to, like, demonic oppression? Actually, I don't think that's what's going on here. And let me explain why. A lot of times pastors, when they talk about Satan, they will describe him like this. They will call him the enemy of your soul. Anybody ever heard that phrase before? And that's actually true, partially. But when it comes to Satan, he is not just the enemy of your soul, he is the enemy of your body too. Which means that every time you get sick, Satan likes that. Every time somebody gets so sick that they actually die, Satan loves that. He attacks your soul because he wants to drag you away from Jesus, but he attacks your body because he wants to make you miserable too. And this father knows that. This father seems to have a sixth sense about that yes, there's a physical problem, but there's a spiritual condition too, and this father is desperate for help, which is why he says to Jesus in Mark 9, verse 18, I asked your disciples to drive out this spirit, but they could not. I went to your disciples, this man says, and asked for help. But all I got was hurt. You been there before? Now, it's at this point that Jesus draws this man close. And he says to him, Mark 9, verse 21, he says to the boy's father, how long has your son been like this? And the father answers, from childhood. It's often thrown him into the fire or water to kill him. Whenever he goes into one of these seizures, I never know where he's going to land. And then the dad says, but if you can do anything, Jesus, take pity on us. And then notice the language that he uses. And help us. I need help. I went to your disciples. They couldn't help. Jesus, will you help? Or to put a finer point on it, can you help? Because here's what this man is really saying to Jesus. I'm not even sure that you have the power or the ability to help. If you can, please help us. Now, Jesus picks up on that from this guy. And he says right back to this guy, if you can, wait, you don't think I can help? Well, Jesus says, everything is possible for one who believes. Now, I think this is one of the most beautiful statements in all of Scripture. But I also think it's one of the most misread, misunderstood, misapplied, and misinterpreted statements in all of Scripture. Because when we read these words from Jesus, everything is possible for one who believes, we make a subtle and almost subconscious shift in a word in this statement. So often when we read this statement, we don't read everything is possible for one who believes. Here's what we read. We read everything is promised for one who believes. If we just have enough faith, if we just believe hard enough, then God will give us whatever we want. But that's not what Jesus says. He doesn't say everything is promised for one who believes. He says everything is possible for one who believes. And there is a problem with possible. Here's the problem with possible. Possible means that God can do something, but it doesn't always mean that he will do something. Possible means that you can be looking for that promotion in your job, and so what do? You go to God and you pray and pray and pray, and you say to God, God, please arrange things at my office so I get that promotion. And listen, it's something that God can do. But it doesn't mean that it's something that God will do, and sometimes he doesn't. And that's the problem with possible. Possible means that you may be struggling with some sort of temptation. Maybe it's been going on in your life for years or maybe even decades. And so again, you go to God and you pray and pray and pray, and you ask God to take that temptation away. Possible means that God has the power. He can take that temptation away, but it doesn't mean that he will. And sometimes he doesn't. And you still struggle with it. That's the problem with possible. Or how about this? At least for me, I think it's been like a lousy week in our nation. It's been a hard week. In fact, I've talked to some friends of mine, both who lean left and lean right, and there's been kind of this universal feedback that I've been getting, which is this. At the root and at the heart and at the center of our problems actually is something spiritual. Like, people need Jesus. And if that isn't clear after this week, I don't know what's clear after this week. And so I did something that I'm not used to, actually, this week. Lutherans aren't known for praying for revival, but I actually said a few prayers for revival. And for me, revival is very simple, just that more and more people would come to know Jesus, because that's what I want anyway. Might as well pray for it. I don't think I pray for that enough. That more and more people would come to know Jesus. Now, here's the thing. I hope that prayer works. And I hope that all of a sudden, thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people are getting to know Jesus. Possible means that God can do that. But I know those prayers have been prayed before. And it always hasn't worked out that way. That's the problem with possible. Now, I know that sounds very dark and very depressing, so let me give you the flip side of possible, because there is a positive flip side of possible. And here's the positive flip side of possible. Possible also means that just because something hasn't happened doesn't mean that it won't happen. Just because you didn't get the promotion last time doesn't mean that you won't get the promotion next time. Just because that temptation wasn't taken away in your past doesn't mean that it won't be taken away in your future. Just because things feel bad right now and a lot of people need Jesus doesn't mean that sometime in the future we're not going to see something amazing where a lot of people are going to begin believing in and trusting in Jesus. Possible does mean that there's no guarantees, but possible doesn't mean that there's no hope. With possible, there is always hope. And that's what Jesus wants this man with this demon-possessed son to know. He wants him to know that everything is possible for one who believes. And Jesus wants to know if this man believes that. And I love how this man responds. Mark 9, verse 24. Immediately the boy's father exclaims, I do believe that. But I need help. I need help. Not just with my son, but with my faith. And so help me, this man says. Overcome my unbelief. And so Jesus does. He rebukes the impure spirit. He says, I command you, come out of this boy, never enter him again. And it gets like spiritually freaky here. Because the spirit shrieks, convulses him violently. It's like this horrible seizure. And he comes out. And by the time this exorcism is through, the boy looks so much like a corpse that many said he's dead. And by the way, kind of a side note here, a lot of scholars think that the reason that this boy looks like a corpse is because this boy actually was a corpse. At least initially and immediately, the cure was worse than the disease. And this exorcism actually killed this kid, but even death is not a problem for Jesus. Because verse 27, Jesus takes him by the hand. He lifts him up to his feet. And he stands up. And a father who had been deeply hurt by the disciples finally got the help that he needed from Jesus. Now, after this boy is healed, and the boy leaves, and the father leaves, and the crowd disperses, it's been a long day for Jesus now, right? He finishes a hiking trip when he's at the top of the mountain. He comes down the mountain. Then he has to do this giant healing service with an exorcism. And so he goes inside to kick his feet up for a while. And the disciples follow him in. And they ask him privately, hey, in our healing service, why was it such a flop? This exorcism was supposed to be like the centerpiece of our healing service. Why couldn't we drive this demon out? To which Jesus replies, well, this kind of demon, this kind of bad spirit can come out only by prayer. Now, when you really stop and consider what Jesus just said there, it is jaw-dropping. Because here's what Jesus just told his disciples. So you guys just wanted to do a healing service. But you know what you didn't do before you did that healing service? You didn't pray. You guys thought you could do an exorcism. But you know what you didn't do before you attempted that exorcism? You didn't pray. Now, here's the thing. I don't think you need a PhD in theology to figure this one out, okay? If you walk into a room and something spiritually freaky is going on, what is the first thing that you're going to be inclined to do? You're going to want to what? Pray. This isn't complicated. But the disciples don't. And the question is why? Like, what would make them think that they could do a healing service, a worship service, an exorcism without whispering so much as a prayer? What's going through their minds? The disciples, at this point in their ministry, they were desperate to be impressive. They wanted to show off to the crowds, oh, we can heal you. They wanted to show up the teachers of the law, oh, we're better than you. Here's the problem with wanting to be impressive. When you want to be impressive, you want everyone to look at you. But at the heart and at the soul and at the center of the church is not a call for people to look at you. At the heart and at the soul and at the center of the church is a call for people to look at Jesus. But the disciples were so desperate to be impressive, to knock everybody's socks off, that they decided to help people or try to help people without first asking for help from God in prayer. And when they tried to help without first asking for help, here's all they did. They just hurt people. Don't do that. Don't ever try to help without first asking for help from God. In fact, let me put an even finer point on this, okay? When the disciples do this healing service, this worship service, where they're going to heal all these people, where's Jesus? Where is he when this whole thing starts? He's up a mountain. He's coming down a mountain. But this means literally that the disciples are trying to hold a service without Jesus. Now again, you don't need a PhD in theology to figure this out. Do you think it's a good idea to try to hold a worship service without Jesus? Yes or no? The answer is no. Of course not. And again, let me put a fine point on this. At the end of the day, the church does not run on the talent of its leaders. The church does not run on the polish of its programs. The church does not run on the desires and the demands of its members. The church does not run on the cleverness of its marketing. We're cooler than the church down the street. At the heart and at the soul and at the center of the church is Jesus. And listen, if Jesus isn't at the center of the church, you don't got a church. Have I made myself clear? And so Zion Lutheran Church, for 150 years, we've been a church that has Jesus at the center. Can we just make a promise that for the next 150 years, that is not going to change? Because that is the most important thing. Yeah? All right, I'm done yelling at you. There we go. Done yelling at you. All right, so two things as we wrap up. All right, just two things. Two things for you if you've been hurt. Maybe by the church, or maybe by just somebody close to you. First thing is this. If you've been hurt by the church, the failure of a church, one thing we learned from the story, does not equal the failure of Jesus. The failure of a church does not equal the failure of Jesus. We see this in spades in this story. The disciples, they're church people. This man comes to church people to get help, and he gets hurt. But even though the disciples fail, Jesus doesn't fail. And this is fantastic news. Because come on, we see the church fail all the time. People in the church say all sorts of crazy things all the time. Sometimes theologically and spiritually, sometimes morally. Just turn on the TV at 3 a.m. and you'll find a guy with all sorts of charts and graphs about the end times. And you go, that might just be a failure of the church, but that failure of a church does not equal the failure of Jesus. Maybe for you it's more personal than that. Maybe you're a guest with us this morning. And by the way, if you're a guest with us this morning, I'm so glad that you're here, and I hope you feel comfortable here. But I also know how this works, right? Sometimes the reason that you're here is because of something that's going on over there. The failure of that church doesn't equal the failure of Jesus. Maybe you're here and quite candidly, even though you'd never say this out loud, you got big questions and you're kind of wondering if the church can actually help you out. Because in the past, the church has always kind of failed you. Let me say this again. The failure of a church does not equal the failure of Jesus. And so even if you got one foot out the door and one hand on the knob, and you're ready to walk away from a church, don't walk away from Jesus. That's the first thing. Second thing, before you do walk away from a church or walk away from somebody who's hurt you, I want you to consider this. It is very difficult to judge somebody's intentions by somebody's actions. Here's what that means. It means that person that you're really mad at right now, who hurt you, they might not even have intended to. So, way back when I called my pastor friend of mine, and I told him about how I was going through this big career crisis, and he kind of cut me off, and I was really mad at him. He called me back the next day. And he said, "Hey, Zach, I just want to apologize about last night." And he continued, and he said, I was kind of having a bad day. And I thought to myself, pastors have bad days? I didn't know that yet. I wasn't a pastor. By the way, we do, just so you know, okay? We have bad days. I know that now. And then he explained. He said, when you called me, I was on the side of the road with a flat tire. And my wife is having some health problems, and so she had to go to the hospital when I was trying to get to her. And I didn't mean to cut you off. I'm sorry. So, this was the guy the night before that I had just called a jerk? Who felt like a jerk now? If somebody's hurt you, can I give you a question to ask them before you walk away from them? To help figure out their intentions? It's a very simple question, okay? If somebody says something to you that hurts you, here's what you should ask them. What did you mean when you said that? Try to figure out their intentions. Or if somebody does something to you that hurts you, ask them this question. What did you mean when you did that? You know, there's this temptation that all of us struggle with when we get hurt. And here's the temptation. The temptation is to develop a hard heart. To get really angry at somebody, walk away, and decide that we have nothing left to say to them. And the reason we develop a hard heart is because a hard heart is a tough heart. And they may have hurt us once, but they're not going to hurt us again, right? Here's the problem with a hard heart. A hard heart is not just a tough heart. A hard heart is also a brittle heart. And so when life's roller coaster comes for you, and it starts whipping you up and down and back and forth and pushing you all around, if your heart is hard, and life begins to bend you, your heart will not be able to bend, and what will happen? It'll just break. Which is why the call of Scripture is that even if somebody hurts you, keep your heart tender. Keep your heart soft. Because then when life's roller coaster comes for you and whips you up and down and all around and it begins to bend your heart, it'll bend. But it will not break. Here's kind of the bottom line of this story. Here's kind of the bottom line of this message, okay? Here's what I'll leave you with. When it comes to getting hurt, people, it's true, will hurt you. When it comes to getting hurt, churches, because they're made up of people, will hurt you too. When it comes to getting hurt, you will hurt you. It's called regret. We all do things to ourselves that we wish we wouldn't have done to ourselves. But at the end of all this hurt, here's what we learn from Mark 9. Jesus can help you. And on life's roller coaster, that's what we need. He's who we need.